the impact of the new Trump administration on business and the supply chain. Joel Lang is Executive Vice President and General Manager of Dow Jones Risk and Research. Hi, Joel.
Hi, Bob.
Thanks for joining me. Joel, how do you expect the incoming Trump administration's policies on sanctions and tariffs to impact manufacturing and the supply chain?
Well, Bob, we've seen with our global clientele uh, 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 over the last few years an adaptation to the new culture around tariffs, and this is something that we saw in the first Trump administration. It was carried on in the Biden administration, and with export control specifically, the raft of new rules in relation to what goods can go where. Looking at dual-use goods, looking at the catch-all controls that require due diligence on the importers of goods, and so customers are already in many ways aware of what the first Trump administration did, what the Biden administration did. I think what is the unexpected piece now is what the level of tariffs that will be and how that will change the existing environment.
hmm And for that matter, whom the tariffs will be imposed on. If Trump follows through on his promises or threats, whatever you want to call them, these tariffs will be across the board. Virtually all of our trading partners, making it more difficult for, say, China to get around them by routing its production through another country before it comes into the United States. Do you think that's a possibility? And is there a worry there because of that?
Well, Bob, I think there is a worry, and I think in terms of what our clients are looking at, they've seen over the last few years, particularly in the pandemic, a situation where they had to adjust their supply chains, where they had to adjust their planning in relation to which suppliers they were working with. We saw the national security driven export controls and tariffs that has led to a shift in supply chains and an inshoring into North America. But that's when within North America, we've obviously seen factories built up in Mexico. This is a different paradigm now. So now there's discussion of across the board tariffs on specifically on Mexico and Canada, and quite a bit of rhetoric in relation to that, but also on European counterparts. And
Mhm.
so from that perspective, the long-term planning in relation to the components that make up manufacturing in the U.S. Is something that's going to be subject to planning. And so obviously there's a certain amount of preparation that can be done to look at the international supply chain. But so many of our organizations, Fortune 500 companies, particularly in the manufacturing sector, are so dependent on components coming from all around the world. It really is a game of whack-a-mole then to look at completely inshoring that, and so
Yeah.
that it's in some ways somewhat premature. Really going to have to see if Trump's rhetoric is real.
hmm So, I'm just wondering, though, to what extent is it even feasible for companies to seriously consider this idea of reshoring, of bringing manufacturing back to the United States, especially in light of what you mentioned about the complexity of multi-tier supply chains? Will we see companies at least taking a look at it as a strong possibility in response to Trump's policies?
Well, Bob, we interact with global chief risk officers. We obviously interact with chief compliance officers in our compliance business. We also interact with CEOs around the world, and when this topic comes up, and there's fierce rhetoric in relation to it, a lot of times there's in the conversation around geopolitical risk, there's discussion around the theoretical events of 2025. Now everyone's trying to kind of guess what will happen in 2025 from a geopolitical risk perspective. We've got a theater in the Middle East. We've got the theater in Ukraine. We've also obviously have China, which and the global competition that's going on there, and looking at probabilities and outcomes that could occur. Now, if there were to be a gray swan event in China, for example, that question gets asked a lot, and
Mhm.
and what we hear from CEOs is that that would be extremely problematic. And that's a gray swan event. Obviously, tariffs are a different function, but again, in many ways, across the board tariffs, complete tariffs on China, would be to the extent of a gray swan event. The amount of interaction, the amount of interconnectedness that we have with China is enormous, and so
Yeah.
the planning that can take place now is there are definitely certain things that can be done, but it shouldn't be underestimated what that complete
Mhm.
tariff environment would entail.
I think I'm hearing this term gray swan event for the first time. Uh, does that how does that compare with what we all know, the much more familiar term of black swan?
Well, I think Gray Swan is more of a an improbable event that may occur,
I see.
whereas Black Swan event is kind of an unexpected outcome.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's I think we're in gradations
Yeah.
of surprising events that could occur going forward, and I think it just shows that there's this heightened focus on geopolitical risk at the
Hmm.
moment, and the impact that that brings to global businesses and really organizations really in this globalization. I think that term gets the idea of the end of globalization gets bandied about quite a bit, but we're not seeing an end to globalization. There's still going to be a significant amount of trade
Hmm.
this year expected. It's just a matter of whether the U.S. will be involved in that trade. The rest of the
Yeah.
world is going to continue to trade, that's for sure. But definitely for global organizations, really looking at how these events have impacted their business and being prepared for adjusting, I think,
Yeah.
and having that flexibility is going to be key.
Well, thanks for bringing some nuance to what is essentially a very complex issue at base. How, Joel, do you think the new administration will impact mergers and acquisitions and the entire investing environment, especially as it relates to national security and trade?
Well, there is a lot of positivity in terms of mergers and acquisitions and private equity investment on one side, and so I think there is an expectation of deregulation. There's an expectation of potentially a low interest rate environment, although that I think that's debatable
Yeah.
in terms of whether that happens or not. And genuinely, I think an excitement in the M&A and sector. Now, I think what's critical is what type of regulatory environment we'll see from an antitrust perspective. There's been a lot of criticism of Lena Khan and the antitrust environment over the last 4 years in the Biden administration on some parts, but then we've also seen certain members of the wide tent within the Trump the wide tent of Trump supporters and also Trump's cabinet that is also given some praise to Lena Khan, including Vice President Vance.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think there is a question of whether the antitrust environment will be favorable or unfavorable. Also, from a perspective of national security, I think national security as a paradigm, national security as a term to use within import, export, and supply chain. I think I've heard national security more in 2024 than I had heard in the previous 10 years, and that will only continue. I think we've recently seen with the uh, uh, President Biden's decision in relation to U.S. steel. National security has been used as
Mhm.
the as one of the reasons for that deal being blocked. Uh, there are obviously with the CFIUS requirements also then further representations that firms need to make when national security is raised. And so again, I guess the outset of my answer is that there's a lot of excitement around M&A, but there's definitely these trends that we've had in the Biden administration that will very likely continue in the Trump
Mhm.
administration as relates to national
Well,
security.
indeed, Trump in his first administration cited national security as the rationale behind those first wave of tariffs.
Right.
as
Yep.
giving him the power that would have otherwise been that of Congress. The president steps forward and takes action, citing national security. It gives him the freedom to do that kind of stuff, apparently. But in the case of the Biden administration moving to block the merger of U.S. Steel and Nippon Steel, Japan's Nippon Steel, you expect such future such deals to come under similar scrutiny or tighter scrutiny by the Trump administration?
Well, I think it's a calculus of the art of the deal, right? In terms of
Mm,
Trump has again with a lot of his rhetoric, a lot of his supporters. I think those that are more hopeful for a lower tariff environment would say that the rhetoric is bluster and that it's leading to coming to the table to ensure that a good deal can be done for the United States in relation to these trade relations. I think Japan was somewhat surprising in a way, is that from a perspective of our the U.S. alliances, especially given the situation in China, that was surprising from an international relations perspective and even a national security perspective to an extent that a Japanese company would be prevented. But I think there is also then Biden's legacy in relation to supporting union jobs
yeah.
and so I think from Trump's perspective, it'll be an interesting signal if we see those reasons being flouted if a deal is blocked in that way. Um, there'll obviously be as a focus on the American worker and supporting American workers, and we'll see if that rhetoric is backed up.
So what do corporations and financial institutions need to do now to navigate these risks ahead of these potential policy shifts? What is your advice?
Well, I think it's continuing a trend, and I think a lot of our customers are certainly um, looking at the trend around supply chain management and understanding who their suppliers are, particularly for the different components that come into their supply chain. Um, our focus in many ways is on that export control compliance piece, and so we see a lot of organizations, in addition to the third-party risk checks that they do on their suppliers from an anti-corruption perspective, checking on due diligence on ownership, on sanctions exposure, on links to military end use, whether that be in Ukraine or in relation to Russia or in relation to China. Also doing more holistic due diligence in relation to the importers of their goods, and so
Mhm.
they don't want to be caught out in relation to the Department of Commerce pressure on catch-all controls and knowing where their components will end up. Now, but this is a hierarchy of different problems, some related to regulation and enforcement. I think, definitely the rhetoric that's come out in relation to tariffs is about also about understanding supply chain disruption, which is less of a regulatory risk and more of an operational risk, and really understanding how supply chains will evolve given the tariffs, staying close to understanding how these tariffs are implemented. Um, and look, we're not going to know the exact answer until the 20th of
Mhm.
January,
Well, and not even
and
then, probably. It's
and
going to take a little
potentially not
while after
even
that.
then.
All right. Well, at least the companies should be prepared, be aware of the possible things that are coming down the pike. Joel Lang of Dow Jones Risk and Research, thank you so much for joining me today to give us this peek into what we might expect in the coming year for supply chains and manufacturing under the new Trump administration. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, Bob.